I always thought my family was the perfect picture of a happy marriage. Greg, my husband, was everything I wanted in a partner: charming, thoughtful, and hardworking. We had a comfortable life, and I was proud of the family we had built together. But one day, everything changed, and I realized just how wrong I was about our marriage. My whole world came crashing down when I found out that while I was slaving away at two jobs just to keep things afloat, my husband had sent his mistress on a luxury vacation, a trip I had dreamed of for years but could never afford. It wasn't like we didn't have the money. I worked long hours at the cafe and did freelance writing to make sure we were comfortable. Greg had his own successful career, but somehow I was always the one picking up the slack. The funny thing was, I never complained. I thought that's what marriage was about: sacrificing for the ones you love. But then I started noticing something strange. Greg had become distant. He was always busy with work, and whenever I tried to talk about our plans or take a weekend off, he'd brush it aside. I told myself it was just stress. Everyone goes through phases, right? But then came the day that changed everything. I had just gotten off work, tired from a long shift, when I was scrolling through Greg's phone, mostly to check my own messages. I wasn't looking for anything, honestly, but then I saw it. A message from a travel agency. At first, I thought it was for a business trip, but then I saw the details. It was a vacation package to an island for two people. The names of the travelers: Greg and someone else. It wasn't just any trip either. It was an all-expenses-paid getaway to a tropical paradise. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My hands shook as I read the details over and over again. My heart sank deeper with each word. I closed the phone, staring at it in disbelief. This wasn't happening. I was the one who worked two jobs, and he was sending his mistress to a resort I could never dream of visiting. I felt my stomach twist in anger and betrayal. How could he do this to me? How could he think it was okay to treat me this way while I was here, busting my ass just to make sure our bills were paid? My mind raced. Was I really just his second choice? The one who held everything together while he played around with someone else? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd been living a lie. All these years, I thought we were building a future together. But what was I really doing? I was working myself to the bone while he was out there, living a life I didn't even know about. He hadn't just betrayed me physically. He'd betrayed everything I thought we stood for. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't stay in the background anymore. I had to do something. I couldn't let him get away with this. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet, but I knew it had to be something big. Something that would make him feel exactly how I felt. I wasn't just going to sit back and let him have everything. I'd spent years supporting him, thinking I was doing the right thing. But now, it was time for me to take back control, to remind him that I wasn't someone he could walk all over. And that's when the idea hit me. What if I gave him a surprise he'd never forget? What if I showed him that while he was out there enjoying life with someone else, I was about to change everything between us? This wasn't going to be just a petty revenge. It was going to be something calculated, something that would make him rethink everything he had taken for granted. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing. He wasn't going to forget the consequences of what he had done to me. I spent the next few days in a haze of anger and confusion, trying to come up with a plan that would make Greg feel the sting of his actions. It wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about showing him that I had my own worth, something he seemed to have completely ignored. I wasn't going to let him keep treating me like I was invisible. I needed to make a statement, something bold that would force him to realize the gravity of what he'd done. But how? How do you make someone truly understand the pain they've caused when they've spent years taking you for granted? I couldn't just scream at him. I couldn't just pick a fight and let him walk away, thinking it was all just drama. No, this had to be more than that. It had to be a shock. Something that would force him to confront the situation and truly feel the weight of his betrayal. I thought about it long and hard. If I was going to surprise him, I needed to do something he'd never expect. He thought he could have it all, his perfect life, his perfect mistress, and me, working behind the scenes like nothing ever changed. Well, I wasn't going to let that stand. If he could spoil her with a luxury vacation, then I could spoil myself too. I started making arrangements. I knew it wasn't exactly what I'd planned before, working 2 jobs to save for the future, not splurging on myself. But I was done waiting. If he thought he could take advantage of my dedication, then it was time to show him how wrong he was. I looked into vacations. Not just any vacation. No, I was going to book the trip of a lifetime. Something extravagant, just for me. A tropical resort with all the amenities, luxury, relaxation, and something I could finally enjoy without the guilt of working myself into the ground. It felt like freedom. A freedom I hadn't known in years. The next step was sending him the message. I had to make sure he understood the power shift. I didn't just want him to think I was angry. I wanted him to realize that I wasn't dependent on him or his approval anymore. I wasn't going to be the wife who stayed home and put up with it. I wasn't going to be the dutiful wife anymore. So I sent him a message before I left, casual but cutting. Enjoy your vacation, Greg. I'm going to be away too. The silence that followed was enough to make my heart race. I knew he'd panic, but I didn't care. This was for me. When I got to the resort, everything felt surreal. For the first time in ages, I wasn't worried about bills, chores, or taking care of everyone else. It was just me, in paradise. And let me tell you, the feeling was nothing short of incredible. Meanwhile, Greg had no idea what was coming. He called and texted me nonstop, but I ignored every single one of them. He thought I'd come running back. He thought he could keep living his double life while I stayed in the background. But he had no idea that I was already one step ahead. What I hadn't realized at first was how much I would start to enjoy this. The thought of him scrambling, confused, and regretful gave me the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't a fool anymore. Greg didn't just need to realize that I was capable of taking care of myself. He needed to understand that I had a life outside of him, that I wasn't just some accessory to his needs. He could try to live in his little world, where he had his affair and his vacations. But I wasn't staying in the shadows any longer. I had a future, one that didn't include him. And that's when I realized the power I truly had. I wasn't sure how Greg was going to react, but I knew he'd feel it soon. The day I checked into the resort, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I wasn't just on vacation. I was reclaiming my life, something I hadn't done in years. For the first time, I wasn't answering to anyone. I wasn't spending my time worrying about Greg or his affairs. I could relax, breathe, and enjoy what I had been missing. I felt free in a way I hadn't felt in so long. At first, I stayed distant from Greg's attempts to contact me. He sent me texts asking where I was, what I was doing, why I wasn't answering his calls. I didn't respond. Every time my phone buzzed, I could feel a small smile creeping onto my face. He had no idea what I was up to, and I loved that. He thought he had control, that he could do whatever he wanted without any consequences. Well, the tables had turned. I let him stew in his confusion for a while, savoring the moment. I could see it now. He was starting to panic. He had no idea what was going on. The calls kept coming, his messages more desperate. But I wasn't going to pick up. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing exactly where I was or what I was doing. I knew what Greg was thinking. He probably thought I was somewhere sulking, waiting for him to fix things. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. I wasn't waiting for him. I wasn't sitting at home, hoping he'd come to his senses. No, I was out here living my life for the first time, free from the weight of his lies and manipulation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much I'd been holding on to the idea of a marriage that was never really mine. By the time I had fully settled into the routine of my vacation, Greg's texts started to change. He started apologizing, telling me how much he missed me. He promised to make things right, to fix the mess he'd created. But it was too late. His promises meant nothing to me now. I wasn't interested in the things he'd said 1,000 times before. I had been waiting for him to acknowledge my worth, to appreciate me. But instead of doing that, he treated me like I didn't matter. He took me for granted. And that's something I could never forgive. When I finally read one of his messages that said, "Please come home. I need to see you," I almost laughed. Did he really think I would drop everything and return to the same old routine? Number this time, I wasn't just going to forgive him and go back to how things were. I was done being the backup plan. I was done being the one who took care of everything while he lived his life with someone else. I had no intention of rushing back. I spent my days at the resort enjoying every minute of my time alone. The quiet, the beautiful views, the freedom, it all felt so right. I realized then that I had been living a life for everyone else, always doing what was expected of me, but never thinking about what I truly wanted. It felt like I had just stepped into a whole new world, and I wasn't going back to the old one. It was clear now that Greg wasn't just worried about losing me. He was afraid of losing control. He didn't know how to function without me playing my role in his life. But I wasn't going to be the woman who just stayed in the background anymore. I wasn't going to let him dictate what I should be or how I should feel. It was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. I had no idea what the next steps would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be the same person who silently accepted everything anymore. I was already looking forward to the next part of my plan. He had no idea what was coming. And that, in itself, was the most satisfying feeling I had had in a long time. When I finally returned home, Greg was waiting for me, standing in the doorway like he was ready to beg. But there was no apology on his face, just a nervous, almost desperate energy that made me feel both powerful and disgusted. I could see it in his eyes. He was trying to read me, trying to figure out how I had changed. But I wasn't giving him any hints. I wasn't the same woman who left a week ago, the one who worked herself to the bone to keep our life together. No, I was someone else now. Someone who had taken control of her own happiness. And someone who wasn't going to let him walk all over her anymore. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice low, but there was a hint of panic in it. "I've been trying to reach you. You could have just told me what was going on." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, looking at him. "What's going on?" "You already know what's going on, Greg. You've been living your life with her while I was here, working 2 jobs and pretending everything was fine." He flinched at the mention of her, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "I saw the itinerary, Greg. I know about the vacation you sent her on. You thought you could just buy your way out of this, didn't you?" His eyes widened for a moment before he regained his composure. "Sarah, I didn't let him finish." "No, you listened to me," I said, my voice steady, though it was shaking with rage. "I worked myself to exhaustion for you, for us, and you go off and spoil her. You made a choice, Greg. You made a choice to treat me like I didn't matter. And I'm done." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand, stopping him. Don't tell me how sorry you are. Don't make excuses. I've heard it all before." I could see the panic starting to creep into his expression. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to me standing up for myself. He was used to being in control, used to me cleaning up his messes. But not anymore. "I'm not going back to how things were," I said quietly, but with certainty. "I'm done pretending that this marriage is anything but a lie. You've already shown me where your priorities lie, and it's not with me. You can't just buy me back with a vacation or with empty apologies. It doesn't work that way." He stepped forward, his voice soft now. "Sarah, please. I know I've messed up, but I want to make it right. We can fix this. We can go back to how we were before. I promise. I'll do better." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything finally settling in. "No, Greg, you don't get to fix this. Not like that. Not just because you're scared of losing everything." His face fell, and for the first time, I saw the man who had hurt me so much, standing there vulnerable, unsure of what to do. But I wasn't going to feel sorry for him. I had carried this weight for too long. It was time for him to understand the consequences of his actions. "I'm leaving, Greg," I said, finally breaking the silence. "This marriage is over. And you need to understand that you can't just expect me to fall back into your arms after everything you've done." His face went pale, and I could see him trying to form words, but nothing came out. He looked like he was drowning in the reality of what was happening, and I wasn't about to throw him a lifeline. "I've already moved on," I continued. "I'm not waiting for you to fix things. I'm fixing myself. I've learned that I don't need you to feel complete, Greg. I never did." He stood there, speechless, staring at me with a mixture of guilt and disbelief. The man who once held so much power over me now seemed small and helpless. And for the first time, I felt in control. Not in a petty way, not out of spite, but in a way that said I had reclaimed my life. I walked past him, heading for the door. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me here. But as I stepped out, I realized something important. I wasn't leaving just the house behind. I was leaving behind a version of myself that had been willing to put up with betrayal. I was leaving behind the woman who thought love meant sacrifice without question. No more. The new me was someone who knew her worth. Someone who didn't let anyone decide her happiness. And in that moment, I knew it was the best decision I had ever made. The next few days were a blur. I had left everything behind. The house, the marriage, the life I once thought I would have forever. But as I sat in my new apartment, the silence felt like a strange kind of freedom. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was the one in control. I wasn't bound by anyone's expectations, no longer the woman who quietly carried the weight of someone else's mistakes. Now, I was building my own life, step by step. Greg's calls kept coming, each more desperate than the last. He left messages begging for another chance, apologizing for everything he'd done, but I didn't need to hear it. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going back. Not now, not ever. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been living in his shadow for far too long. I had put my dreams, my goals, my happiness on hold to support him, to build a future that he clearly didn't value. And for what? So he could have a vacation with his mistress while I worked myself to exhaustion? I wasn't going to be that woman anymore. The one who waited for crumbs of affection, the one who quietly accepted whatever scraps were thrown her way. I thought about all the things I had put off, trips I wanted to take, experiences I wanted to have. I had been so focused on making sure Greg was happy that I had lost sight of my own happiness. But that was over now. I was free to do whatever I wanted, to live life on my own terms. I started making plans. I enrolled in a course I'd always been interested in, but never had the time to pursue. I booked a solo trip, something just for me. to a place I'd always dreamed of visiting. It was liberating to think about my future, not as Greg's wife, but as Sarah, the woman who was finally taking charge of her life. But it wasn't just about the big things. It was the small, everyday moments that felt like victory. I didn't have to answer to anyone. I could do whatever I wanted when I wanted. I could go for a walk without checking the clock. I could eat out without worrying about cooking for anyone else. It was all mine now. As the weeks passed, Greg's attempts to contact me became more frequent. He sent flowers, he sent letters, and even a gift. An expensive piece of jewelry that felt like another desperate attempt to buy me back. But nothing he did could fix what had been broken. The trust, the respect, the love I had given him. It was all gone, and no amount of gifts or apologies could bring it back. I had no desire to see him, to hear him plead for forgiveness. I had already forgiven him for myself. I was no longer the woman who waited in the wings. I was the woman who was making her own way. And that was enough for me. One day, as I was sitting at a cafe, sipping my coffee and enjoying the solitude, I received another message from him. But this one was different. It wasn't another apology or a request for a second chance. It was a final message. A message that confirmed everything I had known all along. I've learned the hard way, Sarah. I made a terrible mistake. You were always worth more than I ever gave you credit for. I'll never forget what I lost. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words sink in. But it didn't hurt. It didn't change anything, because I had already moved on. I put my phone down, took a deep breath, and smiled to myself. Greg might have thought he was the one who would walk away with everything. But in the end, I was the one who had everything I needed. My independence, my self-respect, and the knowledge that I could build a future without him. That was the true victory. And as I looked out the window at the world moving around me, I realized something important. I had finally found peace. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And nothing, not even Greg's regret, could take that away from me. The journey ahead would be mine to make. And I was ready for whatever came next. Months passed, and I settled into a new rhythm. My life, once built around someone else's desires and expectations, was now a testament to my own strength and independence. The space I had created for myself was filled with opportunities I had once brushed aside. All the things I had been too afraid to pursue, too distracted to notice. I finally started to feel like I was living for me, not for anyone else. My work flourished. I was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Without the weight of a failing marriage dragging me down, I found myself more focused, more driven. I was finally allowing myself to explore my passions, to take on new projects I had once thought were out of reach. I even started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I had always loved to write, but somewhere along the way, I had lost the time and energy to indulge in something that brought me true joy. There were moments, of course, when the loneliness crept in. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss having someone to share my life with. Someone who was there through the hard times. Someone who was supposed to have my back. But those moments were few and far between, and they were nothing compared to the peace I had gained. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like freedom. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to be my own support system, to find happiness within myself instead of depending on someone else to fill that void. Then, one afternoon, as I was walking through a park near my apartment, I bumped into Greg. The last time I'd seen him was when I walked out of our house, leaving everything behind. He looked different, older, more tired. He seemed almost defeated. But I didn't feel any anger when I saw him. I didn't feel any of the pain or betrayal that had once defined my every thought. I just felt indifferent. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd see you again. How are you? I looked at him for a moment, studying his face, the man who had once meant everything to me, but had shattered everything we had built with one selfish act. But as I stood there, I realized something important. I had moved on. I wasn't that woman anymore, the one who begged for affection, the one who sacrificed everything for a man who didn't value her. I was stronger than that now. I'm good, I replied simply. Better than I've been in a long time. He didn't know what to say after that. He shifted awkwardly, his eyes darting to the ground. I'm sorry, Sarah, he said, his voice strained. I messed up. I know that. I've been trying to fix myself, to understand what went wrong. I nodded, but I didn't feel the need to forgive him anymore. It wasn't about him. It was about me. You can't fix what's broken, Greg, I said, the words coming more easily than I had expected. And honestly, I've spent enough time trying to fix things for both of us. Now I'm focused on what comes next for me. There was a long pause, and he just stood there, looking at me, maybe waiting for a hint of remorse, some sign that I would soften and take him back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because I knew that I had finally found peace, and that peace wasn't something I was willing to give up for anyone, not even him. I hope you figure it out, Greg, I said, my voice calm but firm. But I'm not your fix anymore. As I turned to walk away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I knew, deep down, that I was never going to let him, or anyone else, decide my worth again. I had learned that the most important relationship I had was the one I had with myself. The rest of my life was mine to shape. I had already started over, and it felt like the first chapter of something incredible. The journey ahead was full of possibilities, and I was finally ready to embrace it, no longer held back by the past. And as I walked away, I realized that the real victory wasn't in leaving him. It was in finding myself again. And that was something no one could ever take from me.